Hi, and welcome back to Mr. Raymond's Civics EOC Academy, where today we are going to learn about the legislative branch of the U.S. government, which we call Congress. Now, last time we looked at the ratifying of the U.S. Constitution and the development of America's first political parties, known as the Federalist and the Anti-Federalists. And these are going to pop up today as they argued about the powers of this new federal government that was developed in 1787, and this included Congress. And this is the beginning of our in-depth look at the three branches of government: the legislative, executive, and judicial. So today we are focusing on the legislative branch, which means the branch that makes laws. Again, it's called Congress, and it has two parts known as the Senate and the House of Representatives. And just a little heads up, this is going to be a long video because there is a lot to cover. Now, some of you have been to the home of Congress, the very impressive Capitol building. And the sheer size of this building speaks to the fact that the framers wanted this to be the most powerful branch of the federal government. Yeah, we talk about checks and balances and each branch being equal, but really the framers had in mind that this would be the most powerful branch. Here we see the president speaking to Congress in a speech we discussed in a previous video known as the State of the Union. So let's look at our benchmarks, the first of which we discussed in a previous video, which says to illustrate the structure and function of the three branches established in Articles 1, 2, and 3, and today, of course, we're going to focus on Article 1, with corresponding powers of the government as established in the Constitution. And our second benchmark, which says to analyze the structure, functions, and processes of the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. And again, today we are looking at the structure and functions and powers of the legislative branch. But before we do, just a reminder, teachers, that this PowerPoint with a variety of lessons and activities are available at Teachers Pay Teachers. Just search for Mr. Raymond's Civics EOC Academy. So let's look at the structure of Congress. And we looked at this when we learned about the Constitutional Convention and what was called the Great Compromise, which produced a two-house Congress. One was based on population, and that's known as the House of Representatives, which back then made the large states happy, and probably still does today. And one based on equal representation with two representatives per state, and that is known as the Senate, and that makes small states happy. And here is a term you need to know, which describes a two-house legislature, and that is bicameral. Now, bi means two like bicycle, two wheels, while unicycle means one wheel, bi means two. So remember, this strange word bicameral is a two-house legislature. Now, splitting Congress into two houses fulfilled the goal of separation of powers. As you'll remember from previous videos, we have a fear of any one portion of the government having too much power. We see this quote from James Madison, which he wrote in the Federalist Papers. We also learned about that in a previous video. Those were the newspaper articles written to convince Americans to ratify the Constitution. And Madison explains, in order to control the legislative authority, you must divide it. So separating Congress into two houses provides a check on the power of each house. Here is a chart of how the two houses match up. And if you're taking notes, you might want to hit pause and write this down. First off, there's 435 members of the House of Reps, and the number per state depends on the population of that state. Whereas there's 100 senators and 2 per state in the Senate. For the term of office, the reps in the House serve for 2 years, while senators serve for 6 years. And here the elections are staggered so that 1/3 of the Senate is running for office every 2 years. To serve in the House of Reps, you must be 25 years old, a citizen for 7 years, and live in the state where your district is. And in the Senate, you must be 30 years old, a U.S. citizen for 9 years, and you must live in the state. Now, the constituencies in the House of Representatives, and the constituency is a word for the people that you represent. This is smaller in the House. It's by district, okay? So we divide the state up into small districts. Whereas for the Senate, they represent the entire state. So we have down here prestige, and prestige means kind of the significance or maybe how powerful you are. And it would say less for the House of Reps and more for the Senate. Serving in the Senate is a little bit more, I don't want to say luxurious, but it's a little bit more influential. Okay, we have a lot of presidents who were former senators, but not too many that were in the House of Reps. And the reason is obvious. You represent the whole state if you're in the Senate. You serve for 6 years, which is much better than having a job for 2 years. And it's just a little bit more important. Okay, so we have the structure of the legislative branch. Now let's look at its powers. And we're going to start with a phrase that you need to know for your state exam, and that is enumerated powers. These are powers that Congress has that are listed in Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution. And you can see right here from the document, the power to lay and collect taxes, the power to borrow money, regulate commerce, make rules of naturalization. Again, these are specific powers listed in the Constitution, and we call them enumerated powers. Okay, so you definitely want to get a handle on what the specific powers listed are. Again, we see the power to tax is listed first, and remember, this was probably the biggest weakness of the Articles of Confederation. When the colonists were fighting the British during the Revolutionary War, they relied on asking the states for money, and that didn't really cut it. So the power to tax for the common defense and general welfare of the U.S. was the first power written into Article 1, Section 8. The next power is to borrow money, something that is a very big issue today as our national debt is up over $18 trillion. Yes, that's trillion with a T. The next power enumerated in the Constitution is the power to regulate interstate commerce, another problem under the Articles of Confederation. States were taxing each other's imports, and remember, commerce means buying and selling and trading of goods and services, another word you should know. And states under the Articles were also willing to make their own deals with other countries, so this put an end to that issue. Only the federal government can do that. Next, we see the power to regulate naturalization. This, again, is how immigrants become U.S. citizens. We see coin money, and we didn't really touch on this in our video for the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, but back then, each state was printing their own money, and that made trade extremely complicated. So let's pause and look at these powers. I assume you know what taxes are. You're probably familiar with sales tax if you're under the age of 16. But a huge tax we adults pay is income taxes. And this is when the government takes a percentage of the money we make. Taxes pay for all the things the government does, from the military to what is called Social Security and Medicare, which you'll learn about in later videos. Okay, next is regulating interstate commerce. Here's a political cartoon from what was known as the Progressive Era in the early 1900s, when the government helped protect workers from big corporations that were working them too hard and not paying them enough money. There was also child labor and monopolies, and that's when a company buys out all their competition, kind of producing an unfair advantage. So all of this falls under the power to regulate interstate commerce, and this has grown as a power over the years. Next, we see borrowing money. The government issues what are called government bonds, and this is like lending the government money and getting paid back with interest. These are especially important during times of war, which this propaganda poster promotes, buying government bonds to help pay for war. Next, coin money just means to print or create money, and punishing counterfeiters is to stop the people who make fake money. You know all about the requirements for naturalization, and if you don't, check out my video called Becoming a U.S. Citizen. Alright, our next round of congressional enumerated powers are the following. Establish post offices. I'm sure you're familiar with post offices, although not a lot of people are mailing letters anymore. Stupid email. Next, establish patents and copyrights. A copyright protects an author's work. So if you write a song or a book, the government protects it from being copied. Patents protect inventions. It's the same thing. You invent some super super popular app, patents protect you from being ripped off by a copycat. Okay, next we see declare war. Now, I think a lot of people think that the president is the one who declares war, and we'll talk about in some more detail when we go over the president, but it is Congress who declares war. Next up is the power to establish lower federal courts, and we're going to be looking at that as well in an upcoming video. But this is the court system that falls beneath the Supreme Court, the federal court system. Next, to raise and support an army and navy, and this again goes back to a weakness of the Articles of Confederation. And finally, our last enumerated power, which we are going to spend some time with. Congress has the power to make all laws necessary and proper for carrying out all the previously listed powers. And this last quote-unquote power opened up a lot of opportunities for Congress, and these are the words that we'll debate over even more. But before we look at this final complicated power, let's review the other enumerated powers. We see the power to create post offices, copyrights and patents, declare war, create lower federal courts, and raise and support an army. Okay, so the final enumerated power is what we call the necessary and proper clause. It's also known as the elastic clause. And this power produces what are known as implied powers. So let's start by reading the text again. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 states that the Congress has the power to, quote, make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing or previous powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. Now, because this power is not very specific, it gives rise to what we just said are known as implied powers. Remember, if something is implied, it means that it's assumed, okay? You're saying it without really saying it. So implied powers aren't written in the Constitution, but Congress argues whether they are suggested. For instance, we see here building dams and highways, determining crimes. These aren't written into the Constitution, but Congress assumes they are implied. Here's another example, the draft. The draft is when people are forced to join the military, and this is usually done during times of war, although we haven't had one since the Vietnam War in the 60s and 70s. We see here this image from the Civil War where there's a lottery for who will have to join the army. Now, nowhere in the Constitution does it say that Congress can draft people into the military, but it does say that Congress can raise and support an army. So they would say that this implies that they can draft people into the army. Now, why was this necessary and proper clause added to the Constitution? Well, the framers knew that they couldn't see into the future to know what types of issues would arise. So this necessary and proper clause allows the Constitution and the powers that it delegates to kind of stretch with the times, i.e. why it's called the elastic clause. And many credit this power with the reason the Constitution is called a living, breathing document, one that can grow and change with the times. We see here the framers could not have anticipated all of the powers that would be needed in the future. Thus, this enables the federal government to extend its powers beyond what is expressed. Here's some more examples. Regulate nuclear power plants, develop the space program. These were things that were beyond imagination to the times in which this document was written, a time when there wasn't even electricity. Now, this clause has been debated ever since it was written, because who is to say what is necessary and proper? I usually ask my students, what's the necessary amount of time to spend on homework? And as you can imagine, I get a huge variety of answers. The phrase is vague, which means it lacks specifics. And from what you learned about the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists in our last video, you can probably guess that this clause was a huge issue for the Anti-Federalists. Those were the ones who didn't want a strong central government. And a fight broke out between these two camps, between Thomas Jefferson, who wanted the government to only do what was written in the Constitution, and Alexander Hamilton, a Federalist, who thought that they should be able to do whatever was necessary and proper to be successful. We call Jefferson's people like that strict constructionist, meaning only what's in the Constitution, and liberal construction for Hamilton. I've also heard loose constructionists. So one of the first things that Alexander Hamilton did was to create a national bank. And remember, he had to do this with Congress. He said, well, the Constitution allows Congress to coin and borrow money, so that implies that they should be able to create a bank to deal with that money. Well, Jefferson was furious. He thought that was a huge stretch. We see here his quote, "The idea of creating a national bank I do not concur in." And Jefferson rallied those Anti-Federalists into a more organized political party known as the Democratic Republicans. We also refer to these as Jeffersonian Republicans. Implied powers have been debated throughout the history of the United States, and this continues today. Republicans think that Congress stretches its powers too far, while Democrats would be more like Hamilton, who think that the powers listed imply that they should be able to do what is needed to carry out those powers, and they should have a little more leeway. Here we see a Republican group attacking the president, saying necessary and proper does not mean you can do whatever you want. Or we see another group, find it in the Constitution. While some others would say, oh, calm down. Okay, you're just playing politics. Now, let's switch gears from our lawmaking powers to powers that Congress has beyond passing legislation. The first power is impeachment. Impeachment is the power to remove a federal official from office. In other words, to fire them. All right, Congress can do this not only to presidents, but also Supreme Court justices and agency heads. This happened the first time after Abraham Lincoln was shot, and a Southern president took over who wasn't really interested in helping the freed slaves. And he was charged with impeachment by the House of Representatives. And this is where impeachment starts. It's in the House of Reps. His name was Andrew Johnson. No, not Andrew Jackson. If the House of Representatives has voted to impeach or fire an official by a simple majority, the case is then sent to the Senate, where a trial is held to find guilt or innocence. If the Senate votes guilty by a 2/3 majority, the official is then removed. The next president to be impeached by the House was Bill Clinton in 1992 for lying under oath. But he was also found not guilty by the Senate. Now, when we think about impeachment, we often think about President Nixon, but he resigned before the charges were voted on. So throughout U.S. history, 19 officials have been charged with impeachment. 2 presidents, 1 cabinet member, 1 Supreme Court justice, and 14 federal judges. But only 8 people have been found guilty. Probably the most noteworthy was a Supreme Court justice named Samuel Chase. Now, charges of impeachment have made their way into political circle as well, and this seems to be a Republican rally cry in the media against Obama, but we've heard it before about presidents from both parties. However, really, official must have committed, quote, treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. So usually most of this is just political posturing. We see here most of Americans don't think Obama should be impeached. The next area of power or functions for Congress is to offer what is known as advice and consent. Now, this is actually a job just for the Senate. The first area of consent, and remember, if you give your consent for something, you're giving your permission or you are agreeing with it. This is on treaties. Treaties are formal agreements between 2 or more countries. Often people think of peace treaties, which is a very important treaty, but treaties can also be signed for trade or over the environment. Here we see one of the first U.S. treaties from 1795 with Great Britain for trade and friendship. And here is the Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I, and some would say led directly to World War II. Now, the president is responsible for signing treaties, but treaties must be confirmed or ratified by the Senate. In order for a treaty to be passed, it requires a 2/3 vote by the Senate. And here's 2 important treaties that will be on your state exam. The first one is NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This is a defense treaty signed between North America and most of Europe after World War II and still exists today. And this was at the start of the Cold War with Russia, something we're going to be covering later this year. This is a defense treaty in which if anyone is attacked from this organization, all the other members must come to their defense. Still an issue that has popped up recently recently as tensions with Russia have been revived. Now, another treaty you need to know is NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement. And this is a treaty between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico in which we trade with each other without taxing each other's imports. We'll come back to these two treaties later this year, but the important thing to remember is that even though the president signs treaties, they must be approved by the Senate. Another area of advice and consent is presidential appointments. The president, who is the chief executive, appoints a lot of people to their jobs, including federal judges, cabinet members who are the chief advisors to the president, ambassadors who represent America in other countries, and head of executive agencies like the FBI and the EPA. These appointments must be confirmed by the Senate. Here we see President Obama appointing Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor, and here she is being interviewed by the Senate, who must confirm her appointment. One of the last areas we're going to cover, I promise, is proposing amendments. Amendments are changes or additions to the Constitution, and we're going to cover amendments soon, but for now you just need to know that this is an important job of Congress, to propose amendments. Now, this has only happened 17 times since the Bill of Rights that an amendment was added to the Constitution. So these are usually very big issues or problems that the Constitution didn't take care of. Now, amendments are proposed, but they're just very hard to pass. For instance, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, which sadly took 80 years, but here's an example of the size and importance of these amendments. Proposing amendments requires 2/3 vote of Congress, and then it's sent to the states where 3/4 of all the states must vote to ratify an amendment. Again, we're going to go over this in much more detail in an upcoming video. And finally, we have our last power of Congress, which we will call oversight and investigations. And this is where a panel of congressional members hold hearings to deal with some issue. For example, there has been a big investigation on a terrorist attack on a U.S. headquarters in Benghazi, Libya, in which Americans were killed. And you might have seen this in the news recently because Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State at the time. And the Secretary of State is the president's advisor on foreign affairs. She's been criticized by Republicans for her handling on the event. Here's another investigation in the news a few years back over steroids in professional sports. Okay, so that was a lot of information. Your class will probably spend a couple of weeks going over everything that we've covered here. So be sure to go over this a few times, but let's do a quick review ourselves. What is the term for a two-house legislature again? Bicameral. What are the names of the two houses of Congress? That should be easy. It's the House of Reps and the Senate. Which house has 435 members? This is the bigger house. Yes, the House of Representatives. What is the name for the powers that are expressed in the Constitution? They're written right in there. Do you remember? That's important. Those are enumerated powers. Name one of the enumerated powers for Congress. There's a bunch. Hopefully you wrote some of them down. All right, if you said tax, borrow money, regulate interstate commerce, regulate naturalization, coin money, punish counterfeiters, establish post office, establish copyrights and patents, declare war, create federal courts, raise and support the Army and Navy. That's a lot, so hopefully you got at least one. What is the nickname for the necessary and proper clause? Remember, this stretches the power of Congress. Yes, the elastic clause. What type of powers are produced by the elastic clause? Remember, they're not written, but they are implied powers. Which house of Congress provides advice and consent? It's one of the two. It's the Senate. What does the Senate confirm for the president? Well, they confirm treaties and presidential appointments. Okay, well, that was a lot of information, I know, and I want to thank you for watching. Up next, we're going to talk about how to make a law, although we might take a little sidetrack and get into politics before we continue on with the government directly. And just a reminder, teachers, this PowerPoint is available and lesson plans at Teachers Pay Teachers, only $1.99. Just search for Mr. Raymond Civics EOC. Be sure to subscribe for upcoming videos, and thanks for watching.